Greetings sailors, and welcome to my first look at the final version of HMS Vanguard. In fact, I think this might be the first I've done of it at all on the channel, although doubtless you've seen some gameplay elsewhere. This is the Tier 8 Premium British Battleship, the first British Tier 8 Premium Battleship, and it's actually quite decent. That's the TLDR. It is not a bad ship at all. And Tier 8 is quite competitive for battleships overall, so trying to find a slot for something these days is a bit tricky, but Vanguard's kind of managed it. Now I'm going to throw some numbers around in this one. I don't always for these early review videos, I guess you could call the first look series, but I thought it might be more useful for this one just to get some sense of what it is and what it does. And I've also done the usual thing of a bottom tier and a top tier game, and we're actually going to start off with the bottom tier game because it's not that good bottom tier. I mean, that's not a unique problem to this ship, but there are a couple of factors that make it not that great. It doesn't have the survivability of, say, the Tirpitz and the Bismarck in terms of its armour scheme, and it doesn't really have a great amount of firepower. It doesn't have the punch of something like the Key, even though that is arguably as, if not a bit more, fragile. So we're going to start off with hit points, because it has the most hit points of any Tier 8 battleship at just under 72,000. Practically speaking, this isn't something you'll probably notice that much, though. It does take a fair bit of damage because it has still a reasonably high citadel. It's not as stupidly high as the initial versions when we were testing this, where we had downright mediocre guns and an incredibly squashy platform. It was not a good combination. But along with all of those hit points, you actually get a stronger than usual heal, because it is still kind of squashy. Wargaming kind of ended up settling on a sort of, but not quite, Warspite 2.0 feeling for this ship. And one of those ways in which they did that is by giving it a better heal. The torpedo protection is 25%, which is on the low end for Tier 8. There are ships that are worse than that, but there are certainly some that are a lot better. It is better than the Monarch, though. It beats the Monarch by a couple of percentage points, so it's not great, it's not terrible. A quarter shaved off any damage you take on your torpedo belt is not to be sniffed at, I suppose. That is Rita Gamer, by the way. That is the Rita Gamer, in case you're wondering. This was a game we actually had on her stream like a week or two ago. I can't remember when exactly, but anyway. The guns. Now, the guns are interesting. They are 15-inch British battleship guns. And as I say, when we first had this for testing, they were distinctly mediocre. They were not particularly accurate. They had a 28-second reload. And so not only did you have not that many guns, but you also had a low rate of fire and not particularly great accuracy to go with it. It was not a good combination. It also had the short fuse AP shells that feature on the Monarch and the Hood and the Queen Elizabeth. That's not true anymore. One of the changes they made was to give it the regular battleship AP fuse timer, and it is quite a noticeable difference, because although theoretically it means you'll get more overpens on cruisers, practically speaking it is one of the factors that meant there was a dramatic increase in the reliability of how these guns behave. And you certainly get more citadels out of them than you do with the Monarch's guns. It's a 4x2 arrangement, as you can see, but a lot of the time you're only going to get to use either the front or rear guns because the turret angles are awkward. This is a long ship, and as you can see right now, to get all of my guns pointed at this Bismarck, I'm having to show basically too much broadside. This was one of the huge issues with the massively raised citadel earlier on, is you could only ever use 4 of your guns. And even now, a lot of the time, you can only use 4 of your guns. If somebody's pointing their guns in your direction, if they're in a battleship, then you have to angle a lot. You have to make sure they don't have much broadside, because you can still get hurt. You can still easily take citadel damage if you are showing a broadside. So in that way, it's actually a bit worse than the Monarch, because the Monarch has 6 guns pointed forwards and a better armor protection scheme. So it's more fragile. It does better at the mid to long ranges. This is definitely not a brawler. The guns don't really allow for it, and the armor scheme doesn't really allow for it. The reload is 25 seconds. It's one of the buffs they made. It's now on a par with Monarch and I believe Tirpitz and Bismarck. No, they're 26. They're just about the same. But it's, you know, it's around that level, so the rate of fire is reasonably comfortable now. I don't know why they thought 28 was acceptable to begin with, because it really wasn't. The turret traverse, another thing they buffed quite a lot, 36 seconds, and that is on a par with the Germans. So bringing your turrets to bear is a pretty quick process compared to a lot of battleships. And you're going to be bringing those turrets around a lot as well, so it's fine. It's quite a nice, comfortable characteristic of this ship. If you have to maneuver a lot, your turrets are going to keep up with you, fortunately. Range-wise, you get just about 20 kilometers, which is quite decent for the tier. It's nothing special. You don't have a spotter plane or anything like that, though, so you pretty much just have the range that you've got. There's nothing special going on. In terms of actual accuracy, it's okay. It's got 2.0 Sigma. The dispersion values are, they're alright. But the 2.0 Sigma especially, you do notice that. And again, this is one of the buffs that it received. So you can, generally speaking, manage a decent number of hits on whatever it is that you're aiming at. It's just the fact that you have 15-inch guns, especially when you're down tiered, you do notice the lack of punch compared to, say, the North Carolina. It doesn't hit quite as hard, but it's probably one of the more reliably hitting ships in terms of actually landing shots for its tier. It's just once you've landed the shells, generally speaking, the damage isn't going to be spectacular. But it does help an awful lot if you're top tier. That the difference between the amount of armor you will meet being top tier and bottom tier is enough that you will get a significant improvement on that gun performance when you are top tier, or even in a tier 9 game where you've still got some tier 7s to shoot at. The shells themselves, I've said the fuse times are a bit different. The AP is actually a little bit less damaging than the Monarch. It's about 200 less damage on a Citadel, which we've just had one of. In fact, it's not going to be the only Citadel you see in this game. It's not really enough to make a difference, but they are different shells. They also have a different velocity than the Monarch's 15-inch shells, and in fact, I think they are the slowest 15-inch shells. They're about on a par with the US 16-inch shells, or at least the 16-inch HE shells. Actually, in fact, they've got about the same values as the Key's 16-inch shells, but because they're 15-inch shells, because they're lighter shells, they lose more pen over a distance. So this is another way in which, yeah, the reliability of hitting stuff feels relatively good, but the shells themselves still feel a little underwhelming. He says, getting yet another Citadel on the Hindenburg. But at range with plunging fire, that's where you're going to get penning shots on Hindi. If this was the Monarch's guns, I probably wouldn't be getting Citadels there. This would be pens. That's a difference between this and the Monarch right there. The HE, it's a bit of a mix. They actually buffed the damage. Initially it was, what was it, like 4,800? Something like that. It was essentially standard HE shells except for the extra British HE penetration. They buffed the damage so it's the same as the Monarch, 6,300. But it's actually got a % less fire chance than the Monarch. And the Monarch already had 35%. The Monarch already had basically standard 15-inch battleship HE fire chance. So it's no fire spitter. You will still find yourself sometimes reaching for those HE shells though, even if it is not a monster fire setter, because when you've got angled high tier targets around, the AP is basically not going to do it. You can aim for superstructure hits, but generally speaking, if you can get HE going and you can get some fires going, then it's probably going to be a more reliable way to do damage overall. Onto the secondary guns, and it's basically the same suite that the Monarch has. 8 dual mount 134mm guns, 5 kilometer range, exactly the same as the Monarch, so absolutely nothing special for the tier. But those do also represent dual purpose armament, just as with the Monarch. And that leads me into talking about the AA, which is actually quite good. It is the dual purpose guns, which are your long range AA at 5.2 kilometers, and then you've got a whole mess of 40mm mounts at 3.5. It doesn't have any of the 20mm guns that the Monarch has for short range. So it's basically all 3.5, 5.2. And the vast majority of that is at 3.5 with those 40mm guns. This is not entirely unlike the rest of the British higher tier battleships. The mid-range AA is basically where it's at. That, however, comes with the downside of it being very easily knocked out. It will not be uncommon, as with other high tier British battleships, to end a game with little to maybe even none of your mid-range AA left. I don't think I had any games where it was entirely knocked out, but I definitely had some games where 3/4 or more of it was gone. So if planes are coming for you early game in the Vanguard, you'll have a pretty good chance of knocking a fair number of them out of the sky, especially if they're lower tier planes. Once the game has progressed a bit though, and you've endured some HE spam, you're going to have far less effective AA power going. You can see from the score screen there, by the way, I did alright in this one. It was an okay game, nothing hugely special. I was able to basically kite away and wait for the team to push across from A, and that's a little unusual on that map, because usually if the team piles into the A cap, they then don't push across the middle. But this time, fortunately, they did, and the enemy team all bottled up in the C cap. It was kind of almost an inverse of what usually happens. So I basically had to hang on. I chipped away, did some damage, helped bog down the enemy team a bit, and that was enough to get us the win. The second game, as you can see, high tier, not even the most damage I did in a top tier game. I had one where I topped 180k damage, but I decided not to use that one in the end because there were a couple of targets that I was particularly farming damage from. There was like a broadside Massachusetts, which I got like 50,000+ damage from alone. But this is still going to be a decent game. At least, I think it's going to be a decent game damage-wise. It again was quite a defensive game, but you'll see how it works out. Anyway, back to the stats. There's only a couple of things left to cover now. It has 30 knot speed, and alongside that you've got a 850 meter turning radius, which is identical to the Bismarck and the Tirpitz. But what is unusual is that it has a 9.7 second rudder shift. It's basically got a cruiser level rudder shift. It feels very responsive. But that doesn't make the turning radius any less. The turning radius is not anything special for the tier. It's reasonably average. So it's not like you can angle super quickly to bring all your guns to bear. It's just it responds quicker than other ships. And if you're the kind of person that runs any kind of rudder shift upgrades on your battleships, which is not really worth it to be honest, but it will make this feel even more responsive, but it's even less worth it on the Vanguard just because it has that baked in rudder response. Double Citadel on that Nagato, by the way. Again, the Monarch probably would not have done that. It would have gotten a bunch of pens, but it would not have been able to get those citadels. Lastly, we have 16 kilometers base surface detection, although with the camo it comes with, that is 15.5. Markedly worse than the Monarch, which is considerably stealthier, but then the Monarch is basically the stealthiest ship at its tier. 16 kilometers puts it more in the range of the US battleships, which are still fairly stealthy, and it makes it a reasonably stealthy ship still with Concealment Expert and the Concealment Module. It doesn't top out the list, not even close. In fact, Roma is not that far off Monarch. I forgot about Roma, but it's more than good enough. It still brings you down with everything to a best possible concealment of 12 kilometers. That's plenty sneaky enough. So if you get those tier 10 games, you can at least stealth up, which is not something that every battleship at this tier can say. In fact, I've mentioned the Key a couple of times because that is also a fairly squashy ship. And oh, hello Destroyer, I didn't know was there. Okay, we're going to put that torpedo belt to work. The Key is about 1.5 kilometers worse off in terms of its best possible stealth. And if you've spec'd for maximum AA on the Key, you might not even have Concealment Expert on your captain, which makes things even worse. So, yeah, it's definitely not to be complained about. So I've already racked up half the damage, in fact over half the damage I'm going to in this one, courtesy of that broadside Nagato. The rest of the team is storming up the west flank. We've got a destroyer in the middle, which we now know about. Fortunately, I've got that stronger heal available. Unfortunately, I was able to take at least one of those on the belt, but there's still a Bismarck that's pressing forwards, along with possibly other things. And for me, this is going to be an awkward fight just because these 15-inch guns don't pack a tremendous wallop. In fact, I'm going to be deliberately aiming for the superstructure against that Bismarck because there's not a lot else I can do. This isn't long enough range to get any kind of plunging fire going. I was sort of convinced that once I'd done with this Bismarck, because I can't turn here. I know it's the Bismarck's guns, but at this range, if I give enough broadside to start manoeuvring around to point myself north, basically, it's going to be an incredibly risky manoeuvre. It's just not worth it. And I'm also barely able to use all of my guns, just because, again, of the nature of the armor profile. So I'm stuck heading south away from everything but this Bismarck, and I was basically convinced that once this Bismarck had been taken care of, that was going to be it. This was in fact also a game I played on live stream, so if it seems familiar, that'll be why. So that Bismarck now within secondary range, clearly not a full secondary spec, or they would have opened up before now, but still that's going to be a mild annoyance if it goes on for long enough, but they're not going to last that long at all. I have in fact switched the HE shells at this point. We've set a fire. There's also several cruisers firing at them as well. And, well, I could try switching back to AP, but they don't have enough health left that it would be worth it, really. I wouldn't be able to reload my shells in time. So, 90,000 damage. Not bad, but I was basically convinced that was going to be it. That was going to be the rest of my game. Because this one was a bit of a ruffle stomp, really. It wasn't a tremendously competitive game from the enemy team. Although standard games often are very one-sided. As it turned out though, surprise Atlanta! Yeah, I really wasn't expecting that. The Myoko has also turned up, but they're half dead already. The Atlanta, however, at this range is more of a concern. Just because of their torpedoes. They're not especially strong torpedoes, but still I don't want to take the massive chunk of damage that that might entail. At this range though, the Atlanta is playing a very risky game themselves. I don't know if they knew I was here, but there we go. I've manoeuvred successfully to avoid the torps. They are under fire from other things, but it's going to be me that gets a fairly significant chunk of this Atlanta's hit points overall. So that's another 20k health out of that Atlanta. And there's still the Myoko as well. Of course, the Myoko also has torpedoes. And in fact, more of them and more damaging torpedoes. But the restricted arcs on the Myoko mean that it's going to be a lot harder for them to successfully make a drop on me. They're not pointing their guns my way either. They're trying to finish off our low health Atlanta. But as it was, I was able to easily get my turrets around. And there's another 10k damage. At this point, I really have done all the damage I'm going to do. We actually won this one by capping for some reason. I'm not entirely sure why. We could have easily killed the remaining enemy ships, but I don't know. The people capping decided we really needed to cap, and that was that. So 120k damage. That's not bad for being top tier. As I said, I had games where I did more damage. Only a couple of them, but they were all exclusively top tier games. You will notice a difference between being top tier and bottom tier quite considerably with the performance of these guns. It's not just how the armour itself performs, but its damage output is quite notably different. So as you can see from this game, quite a bit of the damage was from that Nagato, who was giving me all of the broadside, and it worked out quite nicely for me. But I did a reasonable amount to those cruisers as well. The profitability was okay. It does all right. It's nothing special, I think, in terms of how much credits you can make out of it. And especially these days when you've got the tier 9 premiums as well. Anything below tier 9 is kind of... The profit you make out of them is almost a secondary thing these days. I mean, there are going to be people for whom their tier 8s are their primary money makers, but yeah, when there's things like Jean Bart and Musashi around and the Kronstadt, I don't really play my tier 8s for credits anymore. I have other things to do for that. Lastly, let's take a look at that armour that I've been mentioning for basically the entire video. As you can see, the outer plating is fairly standard all over 32mm, 19mm on the superstructure, so hello IFHE spam. You've got quite a wide fore and aft deck as well. I mean, due to the nature of the design, and I've not mentioned the history of this ship at all, but it was laid down as a Lion class battleship and not completed until post-war with the 15-inch guns that they had left over. It was originally, as a Lion class, supposed to have bigger guns, as with the Lion that we have in game. So it's a bit of a mongrel ship, really, HMS Vanguard. And because of that, you've got these rather, I'm not going to say piddly little turrets, but the turrets look a bit, I don't know, they don't quite match the rest of the ship. It's quite a wide expanse of deck for not terribly big turrets. So it is definitely vulnerable to IFHE spam. You're going to have to watch out for that. The belt, in principle, is fairly decent, 356mm. Although part of it's 333, and the lower belt is just quite a few zones there, actually. Okay, the belt does appear to be a fair few zones, but the upper part is not bad. If you're angling enough to bounce stuff off the belt, then you will be able to do that. But at the angles where you can bounce stuff off the belt, you can't use your turrets. The angles when you can use all of your turrets, you're then going to start eating a lot more damage. The belt armour is going to be a lot less effective. The other thing we definitely have to take a look at is the Citadel. And as you can see, it's not quite flush with the waterline, but it's pretty close. It just peaks up over the waterline. When we initially had it, it was basically up over the where's the one I want? That one. It was basically as high as the armor belt. It was halfway up the side of the ship. It was quite ridiculously bad. You can still eat Citadel shots if you're showing too much broadside, and you'll eat a bunch of regular pens for sure, but you are probably going to mostly get away with it unless you're in a hard turn, at which point, of course, you're exposing that bit more of your Citadel. The Yamato and Musashi guns also bear mentioning here. They will lol pen you just as good as any of the other ships with not turtleback armor, basically. I've had that a couple of times, so it's not a ship to sit and be bow tanking in against. Well, most things you're going to eat the damage, especially the plunging hits, but Yamatos especially, and IFHE cruisers especially, you're just not going to survive very long at all. So it's a rather more fragile experience than, say, the Hood or the Monarch. You definitely want to stay to the mid-ranges with this ship. That's where it's going to be more effective in terms of survivability. So to conclude, do I like this ship? I mean, it's okay. It hasn't set my hair on fire. It's a decent tier 8 premium. I don't find it as fun as the Tirpitz, but compared to the Hood, it's certainly more enjoyable to play. Compared to the Gascony, compared to the Key, I think it's a much more reliable experience. The guns certainly feel more reliable than, say, the Roma. It's just a solid tier 8 premium battleship, despite the gimmicks, one could say, you know, the heel and the massive lowering of the Citadel. Although the Citadel being that high up, I suppose that would have been a gimmick in of itself. So the lowering wouldn't be a gimmick necessarily. I kind of know what I mean in my head, but I'm not expressing it very well. They slapped a bunch of extra stuff on top, and that has brought it up to an acceptable standard. That's what I'm trying to get at, really, is just ignore all of the preview stuff where it was horrible, and pay attention to the fact that it is now a decent ship, that it will do okay when bottom tier, and it will do better than okay when it gets to be top tier. And in that regard, it is no different from the majority of the other tier 8 battleships. It is nothing special. So that concludes my first look at HMS Vanguard. Maybe you'll decide it's worth the price. Ultimately, of course, that is up to you. I will throw in a little mention here of the fact that they have bundled Dreadnought with Vanguard. The only way to get Dreadnought at the moment is to buy it with Vanguard. You will be able to get Dreadnought in a mission as well at some point, but there's no word on whether you'll ever be able to buy Dreadnought just as a separate ship. So that's a bit naughty, Wargaming. I don't approve of that. But the ship itself, as I've said, is absolutely fine. So hopefully you found this video useful, and if you have, you can do all the usual things down underneath it. And of course, as always, stay tuned for more.